Now we are discussing this question where how can sum56 return 11? Ideally you see that 5 comma 6, that is we pass parameters in single set of parentheses, but here we have two different parentheses. So how can we have 11 in this kind of function call? The category of question is again JavaScript language, and there will be three relative questions. Alright, so this way is actually called as currying. Currying is supported by many programming languages. It's a unique way to call inner functions where you can pass arguments partially or pass multiple arguments in a function, but one argument at a time. Now this statement which I mentioned might be confusing, but you will be clear with this in just a moment. For example, when we say sum 5 comma 6, if this returns 11, it is logical. But how about sum you have 5 and 6, this returns 11? It means that here we have two arguments, but here we have one argument at a time. We will begin with exploring the currying syntax and the basic steps. Make sure you have gone through arrow function and closure related sections before you proceed further with this explanation. I'm going to create a code where I implement the same thing which I mentioned in the question. We are going to write function currying. Then we will see what is the practical use of currying. Here I am writing a function called sum. Now the function has one parameter passed to it, and there is an inner function which takes the second argument, that is one argument only as such. But at the end of this function, that is the inner function, it returns a plus b. Now almost the same pattern we have already seen while discussing closure in a question. So here if I just write, let's say closure only at the moment, where I'll say sum. Now if I pass 5 here, it means in the first function, that is this function, this 5 is passed to a. The next thing is, because now this CL has reference of this function, that is inner function, because when we call the sum function, 5 is passed to a, and then this function also returns another function, so that is assigned to CL. Now if I say CL, that means I'm going to call this second function. So I will say CL. I'll create a variable constant answer is equal to CL. Now that inner function is also taking one parameter. So let's say I pass 6 here. When I write these two lines, it means that this function is this one. That is, you are calling this function. And when you are calling line number 7, you are actually calling this function. This means 6 is passed to b, and then it should return a plus b. So the answer 5 plus 6 is assigned to this ans variable, that is answer. Let's try to display and see what is the output. I'll save this, and the file name is curry.js, so I run it here. Now you see that we have 11 as output. This means the first function, that is the parent function, is called, and it has returned the inner function, and that is stored in the lexical environment in JavaScript, and then we are calling it. Now the same thing we can write with some change in the syntax, and that's where currying actually shows its own strength. What we can do is we can call this inner function like this only. So instead of writing sum 5, I can add another parentheses and I can say 6 here. Now this also means that I am calling the parent function and I am calling the child function. So parent function is called, and that returns this function also, right? This inner function that is stored in the lexical environment, and then eventually all the statements which we see here are called one by one. So ideally if you write like this, let's say I'll remove this line. Now instead of CL, I better write answer here. Saving it. Let's check the output once again and see what happens. It still says the output is 11. The reason is this sum is calling the parent function, and the second parentheses which we have given here actually calls the inner function. This is the currying pattern. We will go to the advantage of currying, but before that, the syntax which I have used right now is a kind of ES5 syntax. Of course, I have used const, that is of ES6, but this function, instead of this, we can write arrow functions. So let me convert this same code into arrow function. As you all know that we do not need the function keyword and we put an arrow here. So let's first of all do that. We do not need the function keyword and I'll put an arrow here. I'll save this and check whether this thing is working fine or not. Yes, it does work. Now we also discussed in arrow function question that we can avoid these brackets if we have single line. So for the outer function, this is just a single line, and for the inner function, this is the single line. So we don't need to write the return statement. What if I do that? See this now. I'll remove this bracket. I'll remove the return also. The first function is set. Now let's go to the inner function. We don't need the return statement also. That's it. We can also avoid these parentheses as we have just one parameter. So I can write just A and B. I'll save this. I run it here. Amazing, isn't it? Now we just have single line. So looking at this line, if you have no exposure with inner functions or currying, this is very confusing that you have two arrows here, right? What does this mean? See, when you have two arrows, that means you have one inner function. One is the parent function. Every arrow after the first arrow is the inner function. Imagine that you have three arrows. That means you have two inner function, that is parent, child and grandchild. That kind of pattern you will have. This is just about the syntax, but currying is implemented here. But the question is, what is the practical use of it? For that, I'm going to create a piece of code where we are calculating product price and discount calculation. First of all, let's say I create a function called price calculation. Now this function takes price as a parameter, and inside this I'm defining discount percentage. Now I'll explain what exactly I'm doing once you see the output. And here what I'm going to do is I'm going to return the calculated discount, that is the discount amount. Return. If I just give you one example, let's say discount amount calculation, I want every time I pass price. Let's say I have a function which is going to get the product price from some API, and that price once I have received here, that I want to pass in discount amount. But first case I want to pass, let's say 3% discount. In second case I want to pass 5% discount. So there are various percentage you are going to pass, but this price remains same. Now I'm giving one example where we have just single value, but there can be multiple parameters you want to pass with only one different value. This is where currying can be useful. Let me show you that. Let's say we have this discount amount as a function. I'm not having any get price function at the moment. So we assume that there is a fixed price called 300. So I'll say const discount amount is equal to the price calculation I'm going to call, where I'm passing just one value, that is 300. Now this 300, imagine that we received by get price, that is calling some API, and we are getting this data. So discount amount becomes a function which is going to return various discount amount depending on the percentage, but the price will remain 300 only. Let's try this in console log. I'll say discount amount. See this now. I'm not passing any price now. Price is already given only once in the beginning. This is currying. I mentioned earlier that you are calling the function partially. This is what it is. So we say discount amount, which is going to return the discount amount. You can take it in some other variable and process it. But at the moment, I just want to say 0.5, that is 50%, 5 or 50, whatever. I want to have 50%. So that's 50%. Now, again, I put another discount amount where I just say 30%. Again, I say I want to have 20%. So now, every time you call this discount amount, you are going to get percentage depending on the price which you earlier called. So the same thing is getting called here. That is price calc is called here. But every time you call discount amount, you're going to get the discount amount depending on this price. Let's save this and run the code. As you can see now that every time this is called, we have different values. So this is where currying can be used. This is one simple situation. There can be multiple parameters you have. We just have price here. There can be multiple parameters and only one parameter is changing. So what you do is you just pass those parameters here once, which will return the inner function, and rest of the partial execution is done by the returned function. This is the advantage of currying. Now let's discuss relative questions of this topic. The first question is, what is function currying? So currying is basically calling it partially. We have the inner function, returning the function, where we use the sum function like this, or we can have some advantage of using it in this way, where we just call the main function once and then rest of the functions are called again with different values. The second question is, what will this statement do? Explain in detail. So this, when you see this statement, it means you have one main function, then inner function, and inside that you have one more inner function like this, and that has a return statement. So in a way, this is function currying only, right? But with one more inner function than we saw earlier, and it is going to return the multiplication of whatever value you pass. The third question is, explain practical usage of function currying. Well, currying is an incredibly useful technique of functional programming which solves various purposes like passing partial parameters or avoid unwanted repetitions, like we tried with product price, where price was passed only once. So it is very useful in such cases.